Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Elaine Oliphant. I'm an associate professor here in religious studies and anthropology at NYU. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Religious Studies program's annual Lerner workshop in religion and society. The event is made possible by a generous donation made by the Lerner family. Each year, a renowned scholar is invited to give a distinguished lecture, and speakers address issues that correspond with religious studies department's ongoing mission to explore religious practice and belief as integral parts of human social life. Our wide interdisciplinary approach includes anthropological, historical, literary, and philosophical analyses of the study of religion, and we invite scholars who can help us to think about this slippery category in new and interesting ways. So after a few years' hiatus due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this year we are delighted to be hosting a series of speakers on religions of the African diaspora in the Americas. And today we are thrilled to welcome Professor Alexis Wells-Oghoghomeh. She's an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department and an affiliate of the Department of African and African American Studies and the program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Stanford University. Professor Wells-Oghoghomeh specializes in the religiosity of enslaved people in the South. She specializes in religion in the African Atlantic and in women's religious histories. Her first book, The Souls of Womenfolk, The Religious Cultures of Enslaved Women in the Lower South, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2021, won the Best First Book Award in the History of Religions from the American Academy of Religion, the Outstanding First Book Prize, and the Rosalind Turber Penn Book Prize, both from the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, and it was a finalist for the 2022 Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. So this really important book offers really powerful new ways of expanding the category of religion. In it, she argues that Black bondwomen's work of refusing the dismemberment enforced by enslavement can best be understood as religious work. She demonstrates how efforts aimed at survival under conditions of terror are religious because they incorporate, she says, beliefs about causality, evil, death, the unseen, and power. And they make use of a collection of ideas and performances generated through memory and creativity. In 2022, she published another really important work offering nothing less than transformative methodologies aimed at bringing religious practices that stand apart from institutions and recovering women, gendered, and African Atlantic religious histories in the South. Today, she will be speaking on work from her new project with a talk entitled Enslaved Women, Witchcraft, and the Afterlives of Salem. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wells-Oghoghomeh.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And I will say, as I was sitting there listening to that stunning introduction, I realized I still have my dunks on, and I did not put on my cute sandals in my backpack. So forgive me. I had very cute sandals waiting, but honestly, this is what I look like when I teach most days, so I guess it's fitting. Okay, so thank you for I thank the department for the invitation. I am so grateful to be here with you this afternoon. I want to begin thinking about this together with sort of a story, and I'm not even going to call it anecdotal because it really is a moment that was central to the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about in this next project. So in 2019, I wrote this off because I love to go off script, but I'm going to go off script, so here we go. So in 2019, my husband and I went down to New Orleans. He was on a work trip. I was kind of tagging along. And so, of course, we're going to Café du Monde to get some beignets. If anyone has ever been to New Orleans, you know this is what you do when you go down there. So as we were heading to Café du Monde, and of course, if you've never been to New Orleans, you have Jackson Square, and it's kind of like right around the corner. I noticed all of these artisans and other vendors setting up in Jackson Square. And for those of you who might not have ever been, this is pretty common in New Orleans. A lot of people set up in Jackson Square, and you can buy a number of things. You can have your, talk to a psychic, and this is all out there. So we went, got our beignets, and then as we were leaving, we did not plan to stop in Jackson Square, so we were pretty much just walking past it again, just heading back. I don't recall where we were going to. But I noticed that there was, in this kind of first row, this line of vendors, they had all set up. There were a number of tourists, I'm assuming tourists, but just a number of people kind of milling about, people kind of shopping and going from one table to the next. But, and in this first row, there were 3 people who had kind of signs that said psychic or tarot or something like that. It just one sign. 3 of them in this one row that we were passing by. No line at 2 of them. A very long line at 1 of them. Okay? So I looked at, I was thinking to myself, what's different here? I don't know, just the natural curiosity of a scholarly brain. You just kind of are looking at something thinking, that's interesting. And so I was looking at this person who had the long line, and she looked to be a woman of African descent. She had on a very tall head wrap and was wearing some sort of West African print. That is really the only difference between her and the other 2 people. The other 2 people, I actually, they were pretty nondescript. They probably just had on anything that any of us would have on. This is the only, and she was the only person that appeared to be of African descent in the row. And her line, when I say it was long, it had at least 10 people. There was no line anywhere else. My question, the question for this project kind of, it was already percolating in the back of my mind. I've always been really interested in witchcraft. But kind of this scene inspired this kind of larger question that's animating the new work, which is, and forgive me, this is really what I thought in that moment, in very long scholarly sentences, but essentially what kind of historical or cultural and religious logics rendered this woman in Jackson Square and really other Black women more legible or credible as practitioners of divinatory and or mystical arts. Put more simply, it's kind of like, why her? Why is it just because she looks to be a person of African descent? Is it the headdress? Is it the West African print she's wearing? What is it about this person aesthetically that signaled to something to this larger public that she was much more capable of doing this type of work than the other people who were just kind of lined up alongside her? And so this question pretty much echoed my ruminations on Tituba. How many of you in here already know this story of Tituba? So a number of people already know. This is a pretty famous story. Tituba, very famously, is the first person to confess to the crime of witchcraft during the very infamous Salem witch trials in 1692. And the reason why she's so important to the historiography of U.S. American witchcraft is that she is the one through whom race enters this historiography as kind of a vector of some sorts. Interestingly, not significant in the historiography. She's just it's just a vector of some sorts. Tituba's testimony and image became a part of this racialized mythos of witchcraft in the wake of Salem. And in the histories written about the Salem witch trials in the 17th century and following, or in the 18th century and following, the historical figure of Tituba transformed into this historiographical symbol. And despite this, this is undisputed. In the historical record, she is without a doubt an indigenous woman, okay? Without doubt. she became a so-called Spanish African and eventually a Negro woman in the robust early historiography around the trials. So this shift invites questions about the archive surrounding Tituba. If I were to put a much longer title, which I am fully capable of, everyone should know that from the title of my first book. I like long titles. The more descriptive, the better. But if I were to add kind of a primary, this would be kind of what comes after the colon, the subheading, and the title would be Tituba's Archive. Because this shift kind of invites questions about the archive surrounding Tituba, particularly why supposed African cultural heritage and embodiment rendered Tituba more legible as a practitioner of witchcraft, as described in the trials, and furthermore, why her known indigenous lineage did not carry the same ramifications. At the same time, consideration of Tituba's archive necessitates an interrogation of the record the bondwoman created herself. Her testimony is exceptional not only on account of its affirmation of the fantastical witchcraft assumptions of the Puritans, but also its impact upon the historical arc of the trials. While the trials likely would have proceeded regardless of what Tituba said, her account legitimized and expanded the witchcraft myths that resulted in the deaths of 25 people, the majority of whom were women. So contextualizing Tituba amid 3 other enslaved and or African descendant women's stories, I would argue exposes some of the cultural genealogies that lent her testimony deadly credibility and enabled her historiographical re-racialization, again, from indigenous Indian to African Negro, while considering the gendered racializing work of these witchcraft discourses. Again, I love very long, complicated sentences, but what I am thinking about in this project is the way that religious studies concepts are often marginalized in conversations about the construction of what is called the Black woman. If you know anything about Black or Africana studies, religious studies really appears very heavily in the Civil Rights era. Maybe if you're someone who teaches a little bit earlier, you're going to talk about it earlier, but the number of people who teach early African-American religious history is very, very low. So we're always kind of knocking on the door with people like, hey, let us in, especially, and also same thing, if you teach histories of slavery, the people who really interrogate religion, very, very low, okay? So at these intersections are where I think I have always sat. So through religious studies, though these concepts are often marginalized in conversations about the construction of Black women, I am arguing that religious discourses such as that surrounding witchcraft and superstition were integral to the creation of Black or Negro women in the Atlantic. And not only that, they offered the primary framework through which Black and African women's religious practices became legible in the early modern period, okay? So witchcraft, something that has been heavily identified with European or Euro-American women, I would argue, remains salient as this unspoken framework even beyond 1692. And even prior to 1692. So in this talk, I'm taking a nonlinear approach to thinking about Tituba, briefly contextualizing her alongside a 16th century African woman and an early 20th century Haitian Mambo to underscore the enduring power of witchcraft in understanding Black women's religious performances, even, again, where witchcraft is not overtly named. In this way, the presentation asks questions about the racialized and gendered afterlives of religious categories and the social spectacles born of them. So, to get to Tituba. Similar to the woman in Jackson Square, Tituba was a symbol of exotic foreignness as an Indian woman servant, and that's a quote, of Samuel Parris living in Salem, Massachusetts with her husband, who was known simply as John Indian. And as you will see, the Puritans were very creative, like a lot of early modern period, in how they named people, okay? Scholar Elaine Breslau's examination of Barbadian plantation records confirmed that Tituba or Tatuba in the records was enslaved on the island for 4 years prior to her departure for the Massachusetts Bay Colony with Paris. When in January of 1692, Paris's daughter, niece, and their friends claimed an array of physical afflictions, doctors declared that the girls had been bewitched. Upon hearing the accusation, Tituba tried what was called an experiment to locate the witch, a description that suggests she performed a ritual aimed at sussing out malevolent persons and entities. Such rituals would not have been foreign to persons originating from Western Europe or Caribbean context, despite efforts at suppression in Massachusetts law. Even so, the bondwoman's well-intentioned attempts to identify the evil inflicting pain upon the young women was met with further accusations from the girls, who declared her responsible for spectral appearances, pinching, pricking, and torment. And I think, of course, many of us have seen, what was that movie? Is it The Crucible? The play, but they made it into, there were lots of movies about the Salem witch trials. I don't know, I'm a child of the 80s, and I just seem to remember this very kind of, it's in my mind, like, why are we watching this again? But these are the accusations. On February 29, 1692, John Haythorne and Jonathan Corwin, what's pictured here, issued a warrant for Tituba's arrest, alongside Sarah Osborne, who was described as a, quote, melancholy, distracted woman, end quote, in court records. And we can talk about mental health crises and how those are read. A number of scholars of Salem have discussed that. Even though Tituba initially denied the accusations brought against her, in her March 1st deposition in 1692, she later confessed to the crime and named Good and Osborne as her co-conspirators. The reason for this about-face is unclear, although the strategic and sometimes fantastical turns of her testimony suggest that Tituba understood and seized her power to unsettle her audience in the moment. Unlike most of the accused who decried the ludicrous nature of the accusations against them and lost their lives in the process, Tituba affirmed the accusing colonists' pre-existing notions of diabolical rituals and primordial evil in her testimony. Moreover, her account of the events leading to her arrest introduced new elements to the more recognizable logics of early modern Western European witchcraft, suggesting that Tituba either translated the witchcraft beliefs circulating around her in accordance with her own cultural concepts of malevolent power. So this is something that when we do Africana religions, especially in the early modern period, we think a lot about how people are translating. So you can introduce a concept, Jason Young has famously talked about this with Congo, the rite of baptism by immersion in the Catholic tradition versus the immersive powers of water in Congo religion and Congo culture, mean that people are translating the religious practices in their minds. So they may ascribe value to a practice, but for a very different reason than the person who is kind of showing them the practice or teaching them the practice. So she either translated her witchcraft beliefs, maybe she was mitigating her culpability by substantiating her accuser's beliefs, or, this is something that I'm proposing in this new work, and a little bit more scandalously, perhaps she's preying upon their ludicrous fears, okay? And I want to take a pause here because this is kind of a part of a methodological commitment that I find myself increasingly discussing when thinking about enslaved people. And this is an enslaved indigenous person. But this tendency, I think, in scholarship to assign a certain gravitas to people in the past that kind of renders them less than human, because very few people are serious all the time. And not only that, when you think about enslaved people, these are some of the most savvy people you will ever encounter in the records. And they had to be, because they're constantly mired in this matrix of people who have power over them. And not minimal power, power of life or death, power to cut a limb off, power to take someone they care about. Which means that when reading a situation like this, especially Tituba had already been in Barbados. There's a lot to say about slavery in Barbados, but plantation slavery in Barbados was already in full swing. So Tituba had been around what is still in its infancy in the U.S. North America. The North American colonies that would become the United States. Have to do the very good historians thing. It's not the United States yet. But she would have already understood this, which means there is a strong possibility that when she is faced with this accusation, her thought is, "Welp, you're going to accuse me anyway. So might as well have some fun with it, or might as well give you what you're looking for." You know, who knows? But when we look at this, there are some elements of it that suggest that Tituba is not talking about Arawak or other Caribbean indigenous beliefs. She really is just like, let's make some stuff up, okay? This is a claim that if they'll let me, I'm gonna put it in the book. If they let me put it, if it slides by the editor, it's going in, okay? So here, when John Haythorne first asked her what evil spirit she has familiarity with, this is very common phrasing, Tituba replied simply, none. And then she goes on, this is only a very small snippet of it, so I'm not reading this part yet, but when I do, you will see. I've highlighted the pieces that are interesting, but this is a very long back and forth in the record. So she says, no, I don't have any communion with an evil spirit, and she goes on to declare that she has never hurt the children. However, her testimony is going to take a turn when she declares, and we see that's at the top, that the devil is the culprit, and she says she had been bidden by the devil to serve him by hurting her accusers. And so she's going to continue to use parts of this lexicon of Western European witchcraft in her narrative, but the similarities in the imagery and the logic pretty much stop very quickly after the first three exchanges. So when asked about the devil's physical appearance, she's going to go ham on this. She's like, it's a hog, it's a red cat, no, it's a black cat, it's a big dog. She goes. Interestingly, these are all domesticated animals that are around Salem. Think about this. If you want to make people really paranoid, right? You're going to say, no, it's the chair you're sitting on. That's what they use to possess me. Red chairs. And you're just kind of looking at them like, and what else? White columns. Yes, they have spirits in the white columns. That sort of thing. When you read the longer kind of transcript, it begins to look like Tituba is just pulling things out of thin air. And I think as scholars, we really want to attribute to, no, she's doing all this really deep work, or she's not, or she's just like screwing around with them and making them ever more paranoid. And if that was her intent, she succeeded, because again, she's the first person to do this. The specter of eerie, dangerous presences continue as she details Sarah Osborne's transformation into, quote, a thing with a head like a woman and 2 legs and wings, and her observation of an unknown creature described as, quote, a other thing, hairy, it goes upright like a man. At the same time, she also introduces these more coercive dimensions into it, which I think speaks to her status as an enslaved person. So she tells them she's constantly in fear of malevolent reprisals, saying, quote, I will serve you no longer than he said he would hurt me, and then he looks like a man and threatens to hurt me. She said that this man had a yellow bird that he kept with him, and he told me he had more pretty things that he would give me if I served him. So if you know anything about history and slavery, this language is very coercive, very similar to the kind of psychological logics that are going to be used or already being used in the Caribbean. Tituba's encounter with the coercive entity not only echoes physical reprisals, the kinds of physical reprisals that forced her and others into servitude, but again, the kinds of gendered language that forced woman-gendered bond people into exploitative relationships. Moreover, as others have pointed out, her description of an upper-class woman in, quote, a black silk hood with a white hood under it as one of the manifestations of evil upended many of the social concepts regarding the relationship between race, class, virtue, and vice that circulated in the context. And I have a much larger piece on this in my chapter, but essentially, a lot of the Puritans, does anybody know how they envisioned the devil at this time? As an Indian man. They would actually say the devil looked like an Indian man. This is very, very common in the language. So look at Tituba, Indian, saying, no, it looks like an upper-class white woman to me. That's how the devil appeared, okay? So in Tituba's testimony, members of the privileged classes are the purveyors of dangerous diabolical power, a power that a point which she punctuates by testifying that she had, quote, never before now practiced witchcraft in her own country. And I took it out of this talk for the sake of time, but there's another, actually an enslaved woman from Barbados who is African, who is also deposed in the witch trials, named Candy. She says the exact same thing. She's like, my mistress gave me the witch. I never have a witch in my own country, okay? The colonists' racialization of Tituba certainly lent credence to her claims, yet her testimony bent the arc of history and added a gendered layer to the growing threads of what I call racialized diabolism in New England that would flourish as Africans entered the context in greater numbers. The trials, again, would have happened anyway. However, her status as an enslaved non-European woman with ties to Barbados legitimized her claims and the resulting punitive fervor. So in this way, she becomes the first person to confess to the crime of witchcraft, and in doing so, inaugurated the chain of accusations that resulted in the now infamous trials. And so in the aftermath of Salem, it's important to note that the trials were declared unlawful. Witchcraft was relegated to the realm of what's called superstition, unfit for an enlightened progressive people. And so the historiography immediately after the trials, when we're in the early 18th century, is meant to be very scholarly. It is not leaning into, if you know anything about longer, especially going into Western European medieval kind of histories of witchcraft, witchcraft has like just this long, interesting history. And usually it's not the language of witchcraft, it's superstition that really is the prominent word in those documents. And so they're saying, we no longer do this. So now we can write an actual academic scholarly history of what happened at Salem, and without the superstition that this is an actual real phenomenon. So witchcraft is not real, full stop, and now let's start writing its history. So one of the earliest accounts, really I would argue, the earliest really kind of attempted historical account is by Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who sought to offer what he called a rational history of the events, one predicated firmly on this premise that witches and witchcrafts do not exist among the civilized. Hutchinson demeaned the accusers in his account, saying outright that, quote, there was nothing, or he actually says no thing, but nothing, preternatural in the whole affair, but all proceeded from the most amazing wickedness of the accusers. So he is accusing the accusers. He's accusing these little girls. In the body of the history, he affirmed early accounts of Tituba's lineage, calling her, quote, a Spanish Indian, and relayed her confession that her mistress in her own country had taught her how to find a witch. Even so, in the footnote to the same pages, Hutchinson says succinctly that Tituba and her husband, quote, were slaves, and that the Salem delusion had its origins in the fetishism practiced by these two ignorant Spanish African slaves whom Mr. Paris probably obtained from Barbados. This abrupt about-face in these narrative signals the deep distrust of indigenous and African presences in the colonies and of the metaphysical traditions they brought with them. Drawing upon the religious ideology used to hierarchicalize humanity and create race in the wake of enslavement, Hutchinson names Spanish African fetishism, as you see here. Sorry, I didn't have a pretty graphic. I didn't know what to put with this. The book cover, maybe? It's pretty uneventful, so it's just the quote. But he names this fetishism and not the long history of European witchcraft beliefs as the primary culprit in the trials. So when he's thinking cosmologically, it's not Western European Christianity that is the base of this sort of fervor. It is the fetishism of Spanish Africans. So in this maneuver, he preempts the narrative arc of witchcraft that will dominate the post-Salem American cultural landscape. That is, the idea that the so-called superstition and other refuse of European religious thought remained in the province, firmly the province of Africans and natives. Or perhaps more specifically, European. This is not, at first I thought I said more succinctly, then I saw the word epistemological, which is not succinct at all. Perhaps more specifically, and epistemology is one of my favorite things to talk about. European epistemological understandings of witchcraft offered the primary framework through which to apprehend non-European, non-Christian religious orientations. And what I mean by that is witchcraft and superstition are European constructions, full stop, okay? And we'll see how that is in the next case study, or why that is in the next case study. But yet, this is the primary way, means or framework through which these practices are becoming legible. So lots of questions about the archive. I am not one of those scholars who likes to talk over much about the archive. It's super problematic, full stop. We don't have anything, I don't have much else to say about that. However, I think it's really interesting when we sit and meditate on the archive created in the wake of Tituba's testimony, and think about the ways that she framed, when we talk about agency, she framed her practices in these ways, which is really, really interesting when we think about culpability, I think, in the historiographical arc. But I like it because we oftentimes do not assign culpability to people, enslaved people, at all. It's almost like you can either be a victim or a victimized, or someone who renders somebody a victim. You can't be anywhere in between. And that is usually not how we exist in the world. You know, when we talk about matrices of oppression, we have privileges and we have a lack of privilege, and depending on where you sit, your positionality is layered. And so are the positionalities of people who are enslaved. Western European notions of femaleness and Africanness, particularly African and Afro-Caribbean religions, converged in this account, rendering Tituba's religiosity conspicuous, even though she is attributing much of what you're seeing to her more powerful mistress. Witchcraft and witches also become more plausible via a supposedly non-white female practitioner of a non-Christian Afro-Caribbean religion. So again, this immortalizes her as a victim of these kind of insidious lies, but also as the architect. And I'm using this language very deliberately. Tituba is one of the architects of future racialized understandings of diabolical religious practices. But very briefly, I want to say she is one kind of the most famous of a constellation of non-European descendant women in and around Salem, whose ethnicities and cultural traditions became mired in Euro-American concepts of witchcraft during and in the wake of the trials. Very briefly, Tituba, because she is the kind of cornerstone of this kind of thought piece, I spent more time elaborating on her, but I want to very briefly kind of, again, bookend her. So she's in the center. Now we're going back and situating the story of Tituba amid the hypervisibility of African descendant women and other culturally non-European women's religious rights in the broader Atlantic. And doing so, I would argue, brings into sharper focus the constellation of factors that rendered Tituba legible as a witch and illegible as a religious interlocutor. Taking place less than 40 years prior to the Salem witch trials, the trial of Crispina Perez highlighted the translational issues that ensued as Atlantic networks matured and the cultural cross-pollination of the 15th and 16th centuries produced increasingly hybridized cultures in the 16th and 17th centuries. The fact that women were at the center of these hybrid spaces was no surprise, as the persons most likely to oversee the task of ensuring the health and well-being of a family and its members in accordance with the norms of many Atlantic cultures. Women often shared remedies and sought out ritual specialists in ways that defied the neat bounds of religious conformity. Many, like Perez, originated from cultures for whom allegiance and orthodoxy were foreign. I'm going to say that again. Many, like Perez, originated from cultures for whom allegiance and orthodoxy were foreign, or at the very least, ancillary concepts in religious practice. Moreover, religious actions were not pitted against one another within cosmological visions of battles between opposing deities or good and evil and all these very neat but always not so neat binary categories. Therefore, for many of the African and indigenous women who often found themselves at the center of accusations on both sides of the Atlantic in the 17th century, concepts like superstition, witchcraft, and diabolism did not inhere in their understandings of religious rites. Instead, healing, survival, and protection were the primary objectives that informed their decision-making. Between 1665 and 1668, Perez, a woman from Kashu, Guinea-Bissau, and the Upper Guinea Coast, stood trial in Lisbon for the crime of practicing African rites and witchcraft. She was what was called a daughter of the land, born to a Bantu mother and Portuguese father, who embodied the complex religious, ethnic, and cultural milieu of the African Atlantic, as well as, and I think this case shows you that, the inevitable cultural fissures generated by multicultural contexts. She was born into a family of traders whose network stretched to Brazil. Sorry, again, no picture, no image of her. This is a picture of the fort. This is a contemporary picture of the fort at Kashu. I could not find any historical images of it, though I likely could find a historical map showing you where it is. So she was born into a family of traders whose network stretched to Brazil, while her mother connected her to the Cristons, who are the Christianized free strata of native inhabitants who served as often they were sailors, they were merchants, they were kind of intermediaries in coastal trading settlements in Western Africa. So she had the Criston on her mom's side, she had the Portuguese trading networks on her dad's side, but also being of the matrilineal line of the Bantu, she also was a part of what's considered the oldest indigenous group in the region. So she had a lot of pedigree. Perez was also the wife of Jorge Francis, a former governor of Kashu, descended from a powerful family of Sephardim New Christians. So New Christians are people who, during the Inquisition, are going to convert from Judaism to Christianity. And a lot of them end up on the western coast of Africa. So again, this is her husband, her dad, her mom. Perez is as connected can be in this world. By virtue of her birth and marriage alone, she was connected to so many of the powerful groups in the region and capable of moving culturally and linguistically between various networks. Even so, despite all of this, she was not protected from exportation to Lisbon and 3 years of imprisonment for her continued engagement with the religious practices of her native context. And this is in part because this illustrious lineage also kind of necessarily rendered her Christian. Again, that Christon lineage. And as a Christian, again, we're back to this, you are supposed to be just Christian. You cannot do these other things. And she continues to do all the other things. So in the grand scheme of witchcraft convictions, her crimes were really benign. Nevertheless, the specter of Western European ecclesiastical authorities' war on unregulated alleged occult practices loomed over the proceedings. A number of witnesses testified that Paris, being a Baptist Christian, practiced Gentile and diabolical ceremonies, that's a quote, and kept shrines or chinas in her home. A Portuguese doctor testified to the presence of a clay pot hanging on her wall in her home, an observation which not only signaled her ties to the indigenous rites practiced by coastal groups in the region, but also, this is what's always wonderful about these early sources, many of the people who lived in this region could recognize these. They didn't quite know what they were for, but they knew they could connect something like as innocuous as a clay pot to indigenous rites being practiced, right? And that's what happens when she's being told on. Because for Paris, it's no one close tells on her. It really is officials looking at what she does because she's such a conspicuous figure and then accusing her of practicing these rites. When asked about the items, Paris's brother-in-law responded simply that the item was a shrine or china, and this is a quote, to bestow health upon Paris's daughter. Shrines often consisted of clay pots and pans filled with water and blood of chicken, goat, and other animals, and were relatively conspicuous in the multi-religious Upper Guinea coastal environment. On the nature of the shrines, inquisitors such as Friar Lordeo interwove their interpretations, declaring that the shrines practitioners made were sacrifices to the devil. This was his quote. And through the shrines, quote, the devil answers them any question they ask and want to know. In addition to harboring a household shrine for her family's health, Paris was also known to pour the blood of a sacrificed cow over the helm of her husband's ship and refused to allow, quote, the whites to eat the cow's meat to ensure her husband's safe return from his voyage, a ritual that strongly resembled the rites of the natives of the nearby Bajagos Islands. Her final and most conspicuous offense, and let me just be clear, the whites is a really interesting turn of phrase because racially her husband would be white, which means that it's speaking to kind of this different racial hierarchy, especially because he was kind of a new Christian and form of that Jewish community, which stuck very closely together in Western Africa. He's likely not considered one of the whites at this point by this person recording. So, of course, the friars, the Catholics are going to say this is all the devil. That's what essentially happens. And then she does this household stuff for her husband. And finally, kind of the most conspicuous offense was she consulted indigenous ritual specialists who the Portuguese declared witch doctors. And they claimed that they used diabolical arts and cured with aid of these arts. A lot of these people were Muslim holy men. So again, getting into that multicultural context and the differences cosmologically and how people are going to regard religion in this region. Paris represented a broader cross-class contingent composed primarily of women who straddled the ritual and cosmological worlds of Christianity, Islam, and traditional African religions. Portuguese officials testified that baptized Christians in the company of blacks and black Gentile women and other Christian women go to the place called Vila Quente, which lies a gunshot away from the settlement of Cashew, where the Gentiles have their shrine to which they sacrifice and offer palm wine, blood from chickens, cows, goats, and other animals, and pour the said blood over the shrine as a sacrifice. The women apparently used the shrine to find stolen things and, quote, for other superstitious purposes, and communicated with ritual specialists in order to know occult things. And that was another quote. I didn't put the whole thing up here, but again, constantly tying back to the devil. After a lengthy trial, Paris confessed her crimes, but in her confession, she admitted that though she had committed the acts, her understanding of their intent varied from those of inquisitors. Evincing the cosmological differences between the metaphysical concepts evident in the inquisitors' exclamations of diabolical influence and West African concepts of intercessory power, Paris declared that she had thought her acts, quote, medicinal, and had performed them, and this is her quote, with a good intention without thinking that she was acting badly, end quote. Finally, and very, very quickly, this is the last one, and this is actually very quick, is Kitty Smith. And this is a clip, this is the actual newspaper article, so you can see kind of all the imagery that I'm talking about. So when we push, so Petties is an ocean away, and here's Kitty Smith pushing beyond Tituba into the 20th century. I'm concluding here with this story of Kitty Smith. Though separated by over 2 centuries, the resemblances between the mythology surrounding Kitty Smith and that of Tituba speaks to the entanglement of race, gender, and religion in colonial and later U.S. American understandings of witches, witchcraft, and other religious practices deemed diabolical. And as you can see here in the January 7th, 1934 edition of, now this is, I will say this is from the Detroit Free Press. This story was actually in the New Yorker. It was in a ton of outlets, the Evening Star in Washington, D.C. So this story made the rounds in a lot of major news outlets. An article featuring the picture of a white male Marine on one page and an elderly, she looks elderly to me, a black woman on another ran with the headline, traces his weird misfortunes to voodoo curse of a Haitian witch. The inexplicably long article, as you can see, why is this long? That was my first question. What do we have to say about this? Documented the trials of Captain John Houston Craig, described as a veritable D'Artagnan of the 20th century, whose separation from his wanga, or protective talisman, resulted in the series of misfortunes that prompted the newspaper story. According to Craig, via the writer, the wanga originated from that fascinating island of the West Indies, Haiti, where magic is the science of the jungle, and voodoo is practiced not only as a superstition, but a religion. Marshalling imagery reminiscent of early modern Western European and white American accounts of West and West Central Africa, the article detailed the, quote, dark forests, uncivilized countryside, primitive sacrificial orgies, and savage rhythm of the cultural landscape in which this is what she's called, the Negro witch woman, who allegedly bewitched Craig, was ensconced. The woman was brought to Craig's attention by native Haitians who claimed that she was sacrificing babies in order to strengthen her soul. Does this sound familiar to anyone who knows anything about Western European witchcraft? This is why midwives are going to be so heavily accused. You are sacrificing babies. Recounting his first encounter with the woman who he requested be brought to him, Craig claimed that she looked like a witch with her hair done in many curl papers, and dressed in a motley array of tatters. And here, incidentally, this is a picture of Tituba. This is in a popular history of the United States from 1878. But how interesting the description, the description fits. The corresponding image of the woman in the newspaper, so this is Tituba. Here's the image of the woman here. Now, this is what he describes. This is what this is the image of her. She's wearing a regular dress. I don't know what else, she's just wearing a dress. Her hair is styled, but this is what we're getting, okay, in the description. So the corresponding image is going to, kind of conflict with this image. The only thing we get about, besides his impressions of her hair and clothing, are that she's allegedly of mulatto lineage. And again, this is also a very familiar trope in U.S. American witchcraft. If you are a biracial black woman, you are more likely to practice something other than Christianity. Despite the article's use of racist tropes and racialized gendered religious aesthetics to depict Kitty Smith as exotic, foreign, and even dangerous, a conversation revealed her to be a product of Atlantic exchanges. I would argue the very same Atlantic exchanges or similar ones that produced Tituba and Crispina Petties. Kitty Smith was, in fact, not Haitian. She was a U.S. African-American woman from Elmira, New York, who moved to Haiti and became a Vodou initiate in Mambo after marrying a Jamaican man named Montgomery, okay? And I always say, it's always like a Jamaican named Montgomery, right? It's like I moved to Haiti and I had this whole experience and, I was married and I don't know where Montgomery was. Apparently he was out of the picture, but she was still in Haiti and she was now of a mambo, a kind of a religious authority in the practice of Vodou. After confining Smith to a holding cell, Craig claimed to have seen Smith in her cell sticking pins into a cloth doll dressed like a Marine. And just for emphasis, there you go. There's the cloth doll, the illustration of the cloth doll dressed like a Marine. And he claims to have dismissed the site and proceeded with his investigation of Smith. Fear, according to Craig, prevented the majority of witnesses from testifying against Smith on the charges of her killing babies, and she was actually released. 10 days later, though, he became ill with malaria and remained ill until a so-called, what he called a wizard, okay? It's like Hogwarts. It's like, no, it's a witch, and then a wizard came and saved me. That was the story, and this was in everything, okay? This was in every major news outlet around the nation, okay? So this wizard creates a medicinal protective counterwanga that he sought at the outset of the article. So though skeptical of these accusations against Smith and tales of her ritual efficacy at first, according to this article, the whole intention of this article was to prove that Kitty Smith actually did do this. Kitty Smith actually had the power. So it's this very racist, gendered article that somehow says, but be careful because these women can actually do things to you that make you very sick and kill you. So he heeded the wizards because of this was a conversion story. Like he was converted from a skeptic into someone who believed in the power of witchcraft. And he heeded the wizards, and they continue to call him a wizard, his wizard's advice to quote, keep the wanga near his person all the time since Kitty Smith had sworn to fix him. And the language of fix him is very common in the U.S. African-American tradition of conjure. You fix people when you want to do something you want to harm them. As evidenced by the absence of Vodou rites, there are no Vodou rites at all mentioned in the news article, but very conspicuous presence of dolls and threats of retribution. Modern Western European Christians' notions of witchcraft have offered the primary framework through which early and later commentaries have apprehended not only Kitty Smith's, but also Perez's and Tituba's religious orientations. Such accounts evince the circulations of discourses between slaveholders and others in the Caribbean, British North America, and West and West Central Africa. And I would argue not just British North America, because that's where I tend to focus my emphasis, but all of North America, Francophone, Hispanophone, and West Central Africa about the ritual practices, material productions, and metaphysical capacities of enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and their descendants. Moreover, the focus on dolls, and this is something that we can talk about in Q&A if you're interested, evinces this kind of disproportionate emphasis on materiality. So material cultures become very prominent in the language about witchcraft, which is why even to this day, American Horror Story, they're always with these dolls, okay? Given the disavowal of witchcraft as a prosecutable crime and declaration of it as an unverifiable superstition in the wake of Salem, Kitty Smith and the media conversion of her religion into spectacle become legible only by contextualizing her amid discourses about Black and enslaved women's religions in the broader Atlantic. So to conclude, oh, there you go. I want to kind of fixate on this. This is the diorama included titled Tituba the Witch at the Salem Wax Museum. Here's Tituba. Wait, can anybody find Tituba in this picture? I don't even need to show you where she is, okay? Widening the purview of witchcraft accusations beyond North America to the Western African coast contextualizes Tituba along with Crispina Perez, who, Spanish always wants to come in when I'm trying to do Portuguese, who stood trial for witchcraft less than 3 decades earlier in Ocean Away, and Kitty Smith, whose aesthetic echoed images of Tituba a little over 2 centuries before. The understanding of witchcraft as localized in New England and U.S. American historiography aligns the ways the witch trials and their subsequent disavowal materialized the Blackness and femaleness of Black women's religions via the description of activity in the witch trials and accompanying identifications of objects used in harming protocols. In this way, the Afterlives of Salem rendered the impact of the limited witchcraft accusations of non-European women in Salem disproportionately significant relative to their frequency. Tituba's, Perez's, and Smith's stories demonstrate how the meanings of superstition and religion changed as theologians, inquisitors, and thinkers endeavored to pin down their meanings in response to witch hunts, shifting boundaries between science and religion, intensified cultural encounters, and the increasing reliance upon enslaved labor. Expanding the methodological purview of American witchcraft requires a confrontation with the ways witchcraft functioned as a gendered racial signifier in the centuries following Salem, used to categorize non-Christian, at times harming-focused, non-institutional religiosity among Black women. And I would argue, to a lesser extent, indigenous women, but again, it's something I'm still working through. At the same time, for the women like Tituba Smith and Perez who wielded rights maligned using the category, studying the phenomenon invites consideration of the ways such practices cleared space for and rendered legible their righteous deployment of religious power, sometimes malevolent and retributive, in a world of racialized, gendered violence and suppression. In this way, an alternative spatiotemporal approach to American witchcraft brings into sharper focus the paradoxes and gendered racialized legacies of the category, and in doing so offers a more inclusive narrative of the American colonial iteration of a transatlantic phenomenon. Thank you.
Questions before the reception, which will take place just behind us here. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have a question about the specific context of 2 cases in Salem and in West Africa. Mm-hmm. And specifically what interests me is we have something like Salem, which is a Puritan community, at a time when Puritanism was really. So my question is about like the culture, the context, the political and social and religious context of the 2 case studies, specifically Salem and like the one in West Africa. So the one in Salem, we are seeing that is having a Puritan community, as Puritanism is kind of falling out of favor within the English society. They're kind of more isolated. They're not really welcome in the English mainstream. Where here we have like the officials of the Catholic Church as sponsored, and Perez is, I believe, brought back to Lisbon to stand trial. So have you found like what the distinctions, any interesting kind of differences in those contexts of a more kind of autonomous and kind of isolated and othered community versus the mainstream like Catholic Portuguese context?
Yeah. So a few things. That's a great question with a really long answer. So one interesting thing about, even though we're in the 17th century, we talk about I can stand up there. I was just trying to get out of the way. Oh, yes. Thank you. I feel like I need to have a keyboard and sing somebody a song. So the longer answer is So Catholicism has this disproportionate influence upon Western European Christianity because it is Western European Christianity for a long time. That's all there is. There is no Protestantism until we get Martin Luther, obviously. And so this notion of superstition becomes really interesting between the Protestants, of course. Puritans are the people who are at the time in England feeling like we need to purify the English church, but we're not going to leave it. Purify the Anglican church. But Protestants are overly committed to not being Catholics, okay? So they're going to work really, it sounds funny, but they really are very anxious about, yes, we believe in demons, but we're not Catholics, so we don't exorcise them, And so they're threading the needle for a very, very long time. The Puritans are the end of that, to your point. Or they are the legal end to that. I would argue that these ideas continue to thread through society, just not in a juridical way at all. So the Puritans, the differences with the Catholic Church are obviously you're not going to have the infrastructure to deal with demonic forces. That sounds very strange, the infrastructure. But you did. What'd you say?
As in the inquisitorial.
Right. You don't have the inquisitorial infrastructure. So that is a great way to put it. You do not have that with the Protestants. So you just have the Puritans sitting up there as judges saying, hey, you're a witch, or you're not a witch. But in terms of their kind of core understandings of the disruptive power and the capacity for disruptive power to animate itself in the world, that is something that Catholics are introducing, or Catholics introduced to all of Christianity, that Protestants become increasingly wary of, and I would argue they just become more wary of it because it's like, how do we make ourselves not Catholic? Well, we say that doesn't exist. That's one of the ways we do it. We say, well, you can't, no, there's salvation through other ways. The devil is not going to come in the form of a person and walk around and do things to you. So you still have temptation, you still have sin and original sin and all that lovely stuff that the Catholics bequeath to Western culture, but you are not going to have the sense of the materiality of it. And so, and to that point about material culture, Candy, the person I did not put in, her testimony is much shorter than Tituba's, but what's really interesting is she talks about having this rag with knots in it. And she goes and gets it and saying, well, this is the only thing I did, but I did it to protect them. So it's those elements of materiality that Protestants like the Puritans are going to be very suspicious of, that honestly Catholics are less so because they have very highly material cultures. Their whole thing is just going to be, but Jesus is the way that doll works, not anything else, And that's what they do for a long time in Western Africa. And even in New France, like if you look at a lot of the literature on witchcraft in New France, it's about rebranding. It's really, they're not changing what people are doing. They're just saying the logics are different. They're attributing it to God and Jesus or saints and angels versus spirits and diabolical powers and things of that nature. So to your point, that's the only material difference. The emphasis on kind of materiality is lessening among the Protestants. I should say the only. There are quite a few differences, but they're always threading the needle. When you look at the literature, I have to look at the name and where they are to know if it's a Catholic or a Protestant talking. And the only way I know it's Protestants because they're always saying, and the Catholics do this. And the Catholics are idol worshipers. And the Catholics, they worship idols like devils. And so that kind of thing.
First of all, thanks for the amazing talk. I was at the edge of my seat, so that's wonderful. Thank you for coming. My question specifically is looking at the aftermath of Salem. How does Salem then influence what's happening in the rest of the colonies in the Americas? Specifically, I'm wondering in terms of whether or not, there are these later acts which appear, in Jamaica and beyond, anti-this, anti-that, so
Yes.
to speak. Is there a transfer of language from what's happening at the trials, or what represents witchcraft, so to speak? So if you have this, that, and that, then you're a witch. I'm thinking again of the Obia Act in Jamaica, which has very specific things. Which if you have these things, then you definitely. Has that work been done already, so to speak, in terms of transfer of language, or just the movement of acts from one place to the other, or specific legal terminology or proceedings?
That is a great question. One of the most interesting case studies is Jamaica, obviously, because of Obia. Obia is by far, I would argue, when we start talking about the 18th century into the 19th century, the most well-documented, legally well-documented iteration of these practices in the Atlantic, I would argue. I should say in the Americas. I wouldn't need to really think about that, but I'm a fan of grand statements. But I think it's clearly one of them because of those acts. And just for those of you who may not be familiar, so Obia, or what's called Obea right now, it's Obi in the records, Obrahism. You're going to see it spelled in a lot of really interesting ways. But Jamaica is going to go, unlike what's happening here in the colonies, North American colonies, Jamaica just goes in a completely different direction. I want to say there are a couple of reasons why, but I want to just kind of say this is all speculation why they go this way. Because Jamaica is going to be offer the most extensive legal structure around practices like these. I don't see a whole lot of the language. Every now and then you will see, so Obrahism, Obia, it's definitely going to show up in U.S. newspapers. They're always talking about it. Post 1791, Vodou is showing up everywhere. They're talking about Haiti everywhere. There are these, I think, insurrection as slavery becomes more and more, or the North American colonies become more and more dependent upon slavery. There will be more infrastructure around what enslaved people or African people do. What's really interesting in Salem is how little infrastructure there is in Massachusetts around Africans. Massive infrastructure. I must like the word infrastructure today. I'm speaking like a city planner or something. But there is a lot of infrastructure around indigenous people in Massachusetts. When I looked at the laws around practice, it's so much targeted around indigenous people. They couldn't even come into Boston without being authorized. It got to that point. They were so afraid of indigenous people because indigenous people were kicking their butts at this point. I mean, just like straight up raids, they were fighting them. They were not allowing these encroachments. They had pretty much figured out like, whoa, y'all are gonna just lie to us all the time. So, it's just, they started to fight and people were very anxious about them. Africans are not as plentiful in Massachusetts at this time. Though there's this interesting connection though between Barbados and Massachusetts. So Tituba and Candy, incidentally, both the only two enslaved women who are in these records about Salem are both from Barbados. Why? Because of course Barbados is already now, at this point, a fully realized plantation colony. Whereas the parts of US, what will become the North American colonies that will become that they're still leaning on the Caribbean. It's still planters from the Caribbean. What I am not clear on to your question, though, is why don't they bring, so for instance, when you look at South Carolina and Georgia, all those, which is the context I know best, all those planters a lot of them are from the Caribbean. But why doesn't the language of Obia come with them as often? Why are they not as paranoid? The only thing I can say is they're in a bigger space. One of the things I've kind of conjectured is like, well, islands are scarier, You go to Barbados, and my family happens to be from Barbados, so you go to Barbados, it's like, oh, you drive from one end to the next, that's it, it's done. So if you are outnumbered materially by Africans and indigenous people, you are far more paranoid about what they do. Maybe, and then another part of me is like, is it that good old American arrogance that we were already kind of forming where it's like, y'all aren't going to do anything, I don't care if I'm outnumbered, because a lot of them were outnumbered on larger plantations. So to your question about the translation of language, the language of Obeah shows up, but always, usually in reference to Jamaica, but sometimes they're just calling what they see Obi, but they always link it to Jamaica. They don't seem to, because it falls out of the juridical record here, they're not giving it a lot of power like they are in Jamaica. And just for those of you who don't know about Obeah, the argument is, and this is very clear, Obeah is created through that juridical record. It's the legalistic prescriptions against practices creates what will be Obeah. It's not like people were running around like, we practice Obeah. They were doing things and a collection of things that may or may not have been connected to the same tradition or cultural lineage, but were being practiced in close proximity. Again, thinking about West African people or West African descendant people for whom orthodoxy and allegiance to one thing is not supreme. It's not even required at the time unless you're Muslim. And good number were Muslim, but the Africanized Islam they practiced was still highly steeped in the indigenous practices and ways of thinking. So people still would dabble in other things because it's a part of the cosmology, the grammar of how people practice what we now call religion. So Obeah itself obviously is not a thing until it's made a thing by the people who are very paranoid about it. So the lack of paranoia, I don't know why it's not there. Even when we see it being a part, we see these practices like what they consider African practices, oath-taking and stuff being a part of insurrections. It doesn't breed prescriptions, legalistic prescriptions against these types of practices. It just breeds prescriptions against congregating. That's what you see most often. You can't get together if you're enslaved. But the kinds of stuff you see in Obeah where they're like, you can't have feathers, you cannot have blood, you cannot have nails. They just name things. I don't see it. So Jamaica is always, I think, one of the most interesting case studies in kind of how just these practices can just take shape in very different ways in context. But the kind of other side of that is now we can talk about Obeah in Jamaica because they were so paranoid about it and they wrote all these laws against it. And we know that people were using blood and feathers and chickens and things only because of that legal record. So it's a violent history of suppression, but also a history that left a record of what people actually did. Whereas the problem in the US, or what became the US, is trying to find these practices is really, really hard because people just didn't pay attention to them. It was like, oh, the slaves are going and doing that, or the Africans are doing that. They're drumming, they are dancing in a circle. But we don't have only through archaeological evidence are we getting kind of a sense of the other things that they had, the material things that they were using. So to your question, I don't know why. Jamaica just kind of stands apart.
Sorry, can I just jump in? I wonder, thinking about the Afterlives of Salem here, as you point out, the Hutchinson is coming in and saying, so Salem, the witchcraft, was not a thing. This was, this is an irrational moment an unfortunate irrational moment in our history, led by some diabolical children or and enslaved people. So, is the kind of Afterlife of Salem the refusal to institutionalize or authorize these practices by keeping them random, disconnected, not threatening? Yeah. So it's like the kind of active refusal to kind of catalog and then thereby authorize them as legitimately dangerous, if not legitimate religion, legitimately dangerous practices that have some sort of logic and yeah.
Yeah, no, that is it. Yes. That is it. Yes. And that's why it goes underground.
Right.
It becomes an unspoken phenomena. It becomes the reason why Marie Laveau is always pictured with her head wrapped. I mean, granted, there are laws in Louisiana about wrapping your hair, but I mean, she was so popular, but they always are talking about her as African and a queen and royalty. They're using all these signals. So to your point, like if we actively say it doesn't exist or actively refuse to acknowledge it, then it no longer exists, even though people are still, you know, like we have horseshoes, we have rabbit's feet, we have things, or I do, I'm from Florida, so I have all these things. I always say, I did not know rabbit's feet. Like in Florida, it was very common for people to have rabbit's feet and things like that as for luck. We are just as wacky as the news makes us out to be. But yeah, that's it.
Perhaps, great, just maybe one or two more questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. First of all, this was fascinating. I was very interested in what you have. It's so weird hearing yourself through a microphone. I was very fascinated about what you had to say about the sort of repetition of tropes and characterizations of witches. And I'm sorry to bring this up, but it made me think a lot about the recent news and the sort of characterization of Haitians and
yes.
animal sacrifice and that whole thing.
Yes.
And so besides the sort of like obvious red flags of that, I'm wondering if you, in observing the news, noticed any sort of tropes of witchcraft or voodoo kind of come up in the far-right discussion around like animal pet eating or like animal sacrifice or anything like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is a wonderful example of the signifying power of these things. I mean, essentially, you're taking a known Africana religious tradition, which is voodoo, which does involve animal sacrifice for religious purposes, and you are, the ways that you are, you're moving people very easily. Like the connection is very clear. This is a derogatory, when we're talking about them eating your pets, we're very quickly kind of implicating this in some sort of ritualistic practice connected to their heritage in Haiti. So voodoo doesn't even, you don't even have to name it for people to know what it is, because this is where those tropes and those signifiers become really, really prominent, and you see their efficacy, because you don't have to, the dots, there are two dots here and you can do this. You don't need the things in between. Meanwhile, the U.S. consumes more meat than any place in the world, right? I mean, I think we're the number one, we slaughter more animals, okay, to eat them, you know, but we're talking about ritual animal sacrifice as a deadly sin, you know? So I think that American Horror Story, my students, I taught this class called Magic and Marvel, like Marvel movies, which basically my students taught, because you should actually know Marvel movies before you teach that class. Thankfully, they were awesome, and they were like, no, that's not canon, and they started telling me what it was. But I taught this class, and someone brought in American Horror Story, which, incidentally, I had seen kind of commercials for it, but I never watched it. So someone's like, you need to watch the episode about the woman in Louisiana who murdered all these people. I believe that's American Horror Story. But again, all of these sort of, there are all these cultural cues that are connected and anchored in these religious and cultural histories. These easy ways we can mark a religion and racialize a religion just by describing its practices, I think, in the cultural psyche. And we can racialize religion as well, you know, just through practices. We can racialize practices. Practices are already racialized. So when you say animal sacrifice, instantly people assume, okay, it's not Christian, whatever they're doing. It's probably not Judaism. And I don't know what they would think about Islam in the U.S., but it's clearly not Islam. I mean, I would say that if I heard it and I were a problematic person, but but I don't know what people would think. But you know, it's not Christianity. so that this is what I'm trying to get at, you know. I'm just kind of always interested in the ways that we signify things without naming it, because that's how a lot of things work. That's still how race works in this nation. You know, it's still, there are these cultural ideas and tropes that are anchored in ideas about people and biology and physiology, literally just based on your phenotype, really. It's really phenotype. And we are supposed to be able to understand all these things about who you are just by looking at you. It's a very strange concept that we have imbibed and believed in for a very, very long time. And there are all these racial signifiers and racial cues that we use to kind of ground this belief. And so we do very similar things with religion, you know? And so that kind of, I'm sorry, I can't even talk about it, like, seriously. It's so terrible. Like, if I were Haiti, I would start another revolution just to, like, destroy these people. Like, I don't know. But it's just so amazingly derogatory and racist and anti-immigrant. And it's not just, it's anti-Black immigrant. You know, I always want to point that out, because not all immigrants are going to get characterized this way. That's anti-Black immigrant, which this nation has always been anti-Black immigrant, never anti-Black enslavement, anti-Black work, but always anti-Black immigrant. So we're just seeing another iteration of that. So yeah, your point, you didn't need my rant. You knew what it was.
I know we have a ton of questions, and we just have a little bit of time left to access the treats that await us. But I don't want to cut the conversation short. So what time is it? Could
They ask the multiple, and then I can give them very quickly.
5:26? Okay, we have another 5 minutes. So I know 1, 2, and 3, if that's okay?
I'll be very quick.
Okay, no.
I think my question is super quick. So you mentioned that Crispina, I also want to say her last name in Spanish, and I can't remember the right way to say it, that her husband was like a new Christian, that he came from Jewish lineage. Do you think that, like, A, was there suspicion around new Christians at this time, just based on, like, typical anti-Semitism? And do you think that if her husband had not been a new Christian, she would have maybe had more of a chance, more of like a patriarchal respect due to like a heritage of the religion?
Oh, that's one heck of a question. I don't know. That's a good question. He was the former governor. I feel like if the governor can't get it done, then who can? I don't know. So yes, there was more suspicion around new Christians. Not so much though in West Africa. In West Africa, they still kind of lived apart. So it's not like, oh, you're Portuguese, I'm Portuguese, let's just be in the fort together. There was a new, I know, but they were in the fort. So I showed you all the fort. There was an actual new Christian / Jewish corridor, like a whole neighborhood in the fort, just new Christians. There were most of the accusations that happened in Western Africa around witchcraft and religious infractions in this time are going to be against new Christians. So in some ways, I want to say him being a new Christian might have cast more suspicion because, again, her Black family didn't sell her out. Remember, her dad is Portuguese. I don't think, he's not a new Christian. But that side didn't, her dad was probably the only one of his family there. The new Christians, her husband, his whole family was there. They just said, oh no, she was just doing this to get help. And one of the things, if this is a long trial record, her husband often went with her because it was their daughter they were trying to protect. Her husband also, his health was sometimes in and out, so she would make sacrifices for him. So I think in some ways, there's something about, gosh, your question's making me really think. This is the last thing I'm gonna say. I wonder if it's something, this is me thinking aloud, so don't take this to the bank, okay? And if this is wrong, I didn't say it, okay? But I think there's something to be said. New Christians, of course, are Jews who converted. And I do this because conversion is such a sticky subject. Catherine Gerbner has written about, like a lot of people write about, like the problems of conversion. So, and we never want to say you didn't actually do it. But there's something to be said for the kind of layering that happens in conversion. When, especially if you say, oh, I once was Jewish, now I'm Christian, but I still do a few Jewish things, but I'm still a Christian, and that's what they were. Which is why they always got in trouble as a community in Western Africa, in Kashu. And again, like I said, if you look at the trial record, the Inquisition records from that region, it's basically against new Christians for the most part. So I wonder if that layering did cast more suspicion on her and made her husband and his family more likely to participate in indigenous rights as well. You have some?
Especially if you're smearing blood over something as a form of protection, right? I mean,
Yes.
I mean, it's the blood on the prow of the boat, it's the blood over the lintel to tell the angel of the Lord to pass you over. I mean, it's,
That is it. Yes, this is why you have a room full of smart people. Absolutely. I actually did not think about that. That is absolutely right. So that would.
That's the first thing I thought of when you talked about that. I was like, oh.
I never thought about that. Okay, I'm gonna cite you on that. I'm gonna cite you on that. No, I'm serious because I didn't think about that. I didn't think at all about her husband's Jewish heritage I didn't really dissect it as a factor, honestly, because he was the governor, he was powerful. But you're right, like, this would make a lot of sense, which is why his family didn't sell her out. His family is like, what is she doing wrong? Her family didn't sell her out. The people who sold her out were the non-Jewish Portuguese who lived in the region. That's all who testified against her.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
So I'm going to limit myself to one question because I had like three, but I'm going to just have the one that I think is the most interesting is when you talked about Kitty Smith's accusation by a Marine, my first thought was this during the occupation, the United States occupation of Haiti?
Yeah.
And then sort of how does this Afterlife of Salem live in American military operations in the Caribbean and the justification for U.S. military control and spheres of influence over Black Caribbean communities?
Oh my gosh. Can y'all just write this book for me? Man, so it's interesting because Kitty Smith was something that I ran across when I inadvertently, because I always say I'm allergic to the 20th century. I don't want to think about it. I'll teach it, but I don't really think about it in my work. But I thought it was so fascinating because of how it was kind of hearkening all these very similar tropes from a bygone era. But to your point, military occupation of Haiti, this is, what are the dates? I don't know the dates on that.
Well, I know it ended in
1934, and this article is, what year is this article? Is it 1934? I think the article is published. Yeah, the article's published in 34. So that could very well be one of the reasons why this is making the rounds, because we need to further encroach. And you see the same thing happening with Haiti to this day. We need to control, and not just with Haiti, with a lot of, religion becomes one of those reasons why we have to control. We have to colonize. We have to occupy. But absolutely, again, another connection I didn't make, but yeah, 34 is when this is making the rounds of the U.S. newspapers, and that's when the occupation is ending, according to you all. So yeah, absolutely. Incidentally, one of the things that, if I'm tracking, so Danielle Boas, of course, wrote the book Vodou. That book just came out, the history of a racial slur, where she's tracing kind of the legal prescriptions against this term. But it does seem to match up with these moments of occupation or colonization or attempts at it or attempts at an embargo. So the political moves in some ways do align with kind of the religious, or the language or the heightened spectacle of the religions of the regions. But that's something that I had not thought about, so thank you for that. Yeah.
Hi,
Once again, thank you for the lecture. It was maybe one of the most entertaining I've been to at NYU, so thank you.
Thank you. Write that to my Stanford students. They don't ever think I'm that interesting. Yeah.
Really?
Right. I'm going to tell them you said this.
You know what? I've been seeing Stanford hats all around, like New York recently, so I'll tell all of them.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Do. Let 'em know.
My question is, so you mentioned the Crucible, and I found that appropriate because it's the Afterlives of Salem, and that movie was made in, I think, 94. And it still gets the perspective of the witch trials wrong. We know that the script was written in the 50s by Arthur Miller, but how have you seen the change from, let's be generous and say 54, when we were still marking the story of witches and using it as entertainment without actually fact-checking anything and just saying, oh, they dance naked in the woods, they must be witches. How has that changed in more recent times? Have you seen a change? You mentioned lots of movies about Salem. If there is, are there any specifics? Because I would love to know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm partially handicapped by my lack of knowledge of pop culture, but let me stop. So when I did Magic and Marvel, we looked at WandaVision, which I liked as a general person watching it. I loved it, actually. Yeah, I see some people head shaking. It was just like, yeah, this is so good. But, you know, and one thing that they did there that I found really interesting was they kind of inverted the narrative of maternity around witches, because witches are historically presented as women who are not connected to children except in this kind of very predatory way. And in some ways they kept that, but these were her children, and maternity turns her into kind of the more powerful. I don't know if she's evil. I think she's just powerful, and Marvel doesn't know what to do with it. Because I was like, clearly, why isn't it? There should be no fight. Like, if we're doing tangentially, there should be no fight when Wanda's in the fight. Like, she's clearly more powerful than any other villain. So I'm like, Thanos versus Wanda, this is not hard. But Marvel is not as innovative as they should be. So I thought WandaVision was an interesting portrayal of a witch. I'm interested to see what Disney does in this next iteration with Agatha, because I'm thinking about teaching the class again. American Horror Story, I did not watch it. I found the imagery to be really interesting because I did look at some of the imagery of it, and the imagery, Angela Bassett portrayed Marie Laveau. Yeah, okay, yes. I'm making sure I'm right. Your head shakes is saying yes. And the imagery of it was all like her with a snake. Like a lot of snake imagery, which is very, it's hearkening actually voodoo in Louisiana, the religious tradition, and Damballa, who is the most conspicuous deity in that iteration. Now, Vodou in Haiti is not voodoo in Louisiana. Big V voodoo, a capital V, not little v voodoo. But them using the snake imagery, I didn't know how I felt about it. I was kind of ambivalent about it because I didn't watch it. So I don't know how they used it. I don't know how they portrayed Marie Laveau. A part of me feels like, yes, the Crucible got it wrong. But we are still in this moment where we're talking about Haitians eating pets, and this is effective. You wouldn't say it if it wasn't effective in some way. So it makes me wonder, if we have come that far in how we understand people who practice non-Christian religions, particularly Africana religions, religions that are rooted in African or African-descended peoples' experiences and histories, because there's still this element of the exotic to it and the mystical. So I don't know, but then when it comes to talking about Western European lineages of witchcraft, I do think there's been some redemption because of people like Starhawk and talking about, the feminist movement and kind of reclaiming the witch as a figure of power and cultural power. Blitches, which a lot of people are starting to talk about, black witches, are using this as a reclamation moment. and using the language of witch, which is actually not indigenous to a lot of African and African American communities. Well, I should say they're indigenous now to African communities, West African communities, but they really historically weren't. You would talk about witches as spirits that could, for lack of a better term, possess someone and make them do things, but it was a spirit, not the person. A person was not like innately a witch or anything like that. And witch in African American cultural traditions is just not a term that is used. Conjurer is by far the most prominent term. If you were somebody who could do this, you were a root worker or a conjurer. Most likely a conjurer if you could kind of wield ritual rites towards healing or harming. So blitches is a really interesting, I think, reclamation or redefinition of the term. Whereas I think what's happening with Western European lineages and people leaning into these heritages is thinking about it as like the feminine goddesses and kind of the problematic relationship Western cultures have had towards feminine power or female-based power. So I say all this to say yes and no. Those are the good things I've seen. WandaVision, Agatha, I saw the previews. Looks very Halloween-y. I'm not really sure. I don't think Disney is interested in reclaiming. But I do like what's happening in these online communities with reclamation of the term and kind of rethinking the category.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for this fascinating talk and for all your fantastic questions. I just want to let you know that we are having 2 more talks in this series. On Monday, October 28th, Diane Stewart will be speaking at the same place, same time. And on Thursday, November 14th, Judith Castleberry will be speaking at the same place, same time. So please do join us for the continuation of this series. And please join us now for some snacks and drinks in the lounge directly behind us. Thank you again so much for coming.